Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus mini-sodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive mini-sode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm your hostess, Lori Adams Brown, and you are listening to episode 25. On our show today, just a little bit of warning. If you have little ears and car seats in the back of the car or near where you're listening, you may want to just hit pause and save it for later when you can have some headphones on, maybe when you're cooking dinner. This is going to be an episode that would not be appropriate for young ones to hear, but it is a very important topic. And so I do hope that you find a way to listen to it, on your own, maybe even alongside your husband. If you're married, or if you're a man, listening to it alongside your wife, since the topic is a very important one, a very special one, but we just want to save it when little ears are not around. My guest today, continuing our Women in the Church series, is Sheila Gregoire. Sheila is a very popular speaker, author of 9 books. She's also a marriage blogger. One of her best-selling books is The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex. Her latest book that she'll be talking about some today is The Great Sex Rescue. It's coming out in early March. She loves to encourage women in their relationships, both with God and also with their husbands. And she has a husband and children herself, but she recognizes that a lot of the dynamics that we're going to talk about surrounding sexuality and a lot of those messages, it affects us on multiple levels. So she loves just to be an encourager to people with their relationships at home, with their husbands, their children, their friends, but most importantly, how women relate to God. Her passion is for marriage. And she and her husband, Keith, both speak together at marriage outreaches and FamilyLife Canada marriage conferences. Sheila is truly about authenticity, and she wants to just give real solutions in the very messy and real problems that women and couples can face. So you'll find her to be very practical, very straightforward. You can usually find her in Belleville, Ontario in Canada, where she lives. She says that she's constantly texting her 2 young married daughters, and they've worked on some projects together, which you'll find on her website. And she loves knitting. How normal and just regular is that? And it sounds like she probably got a lot of that done during the pandemic. And she likes to text and knit simultaneously. So she's quite the multitasker. So let's welcome to today's show, Sheila Gregoire. Hi, Sheila. Thanks for being on the show today.
I'm excited. This is going to be a fun conversation.
is. It really is. So, for my listeners that aren't familiar with who you are, why don't you give us a little introduction, like your background and your family and what you currently do?
Okay, so I run to lovehonorandvacuum.com, which is the largest single blogger marriage blog, which sounds very elite, but it just simply is a lot of work. but
Yeah.
I love doing it. I've been doing it since 2008. And I started writing just because I was a stay-at-home mom and I wanted something to do. And it started with magazine articles, and then I got a few small books, and then I started blogging, and then as I blogged, the more I talked about sex, the bigger my blog got. So then I started writing books about sex, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, 31 Days to Great Sex, and now The Great Sex Rescue, which is coming out in March. And this has kind of become my thing, which is really weird because sex was like the worst part of our marriage when we first got married. But but that means that I've had a lot to learn. So I guess I have a lot to talk about.
Yeah. Well, isn't it often that's how it is, that the hard things we go
Mhm.
through, once we process them and get a little distance from it, it's an opportunity for us to be helping others, which a lot of people on my podcast end up being in those situations. We're all trying to make a difference in the world, and you are certainly making a huge difference. So I definitely wanted you on the show today because you have a lot to say around this topic. And I know that marriage is something you and your husband have both been involved with at different points, right? Of doing marriage conferences. Cause
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, so since 2005, we've spoken at FamilyLife Canada marriage conferences around Canada. And the Family Life conference in Canada is very different from the one in the US. So
Okay.
couples speak together. It's really it's geared towards emotional oneness and emotional health far more than it is towards gender roles. So
Good.
it's a really fun conference. We have so much fun doing them together,
Aw.
and he's been pulling back from work a little bit. He's a pediatrician and he's been working more part-time so that he can help me on the blog a little bit. And we're co-authoring the Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex right now, which is going to come out, I don't know, in a year or two. So
That's awesome. I love the
mhm.
mutuality of that. It's really
Yeah.
beautiful to see. And ministry in particular, I think that's where it's just got a beauty in a different level, especially when husbands and wives are involved in helping other marriages. Because I mean, that's how marriage should be, right? It should be something that is beautiful between the two of you to the point of overflowing to others.
Hmm.
And it sounds like that's what you guys are doing. So that's awesome. Well, I would love to give you a chance just to talk about your latest book and why you decided to write it.
Yeah, well, it's not available till March, although you can pre-order it now, but it will be launching in March. And the Great Sex Rescue is based on the largest survey that's ever been done of Christian women. So we surveyed 20,000 women. It was a really long survey, like 160 questions, everything about sex and marriage. So this is a lot of data. We learned so much. And what we were really looking at was we were trying to measure the effects of certain key evangelical teachings on
Mhm.
women's marital satisfaction, sexual satisfaction, and levels of sexual pain.
Yeah.
And we found some really interesting stuff. So, and then we also looked at the best sellers in the marriage category and in the sex categories in the Christian world, and we looked at which teachings they were promoting and seeing where some of this bad stuff came from and what we can do to reframe the message around sexuality in the church.
Well, I just want to say thank you for doing this. It's a huge undertaking and so needed. I myself am not a therapist. I don't even have that gift nor actual interest, but I care about people and I care about marriages and my friends. And I just have seen over the years, especially in the white evangelical church in North America, that I'm just sort of getting a taste of in the last year and a half, having moved here from Singapore. There are some messages that are really, to me, more based on culture than what the
Hmm.
scriptures actually say, and that's certainly troubling for me as a pastor, and for me as a person who cares about people being healthy. And there's a lot of people's lenses that come into the Bible when we read it. We all have a lens. But
Hmm.
I think it's important to define that lens and know how it can hold us back. And once we take those glasses off, we get a chance to see it in a different way. So I want to unpack some things with you here. And I know you have a lot of awesome information based on that data. But I guess my first question is, when it comes to women in the North American church, what are some of the messages that are not quite right that stand out to you that you think need to be cleared up?
Well, if we're talking about women in general, I would say the biggest one is the definition of submission.
Mm,
Now, this isn't something that our book dealt with a lot because we were really looking more just at the sex side.
right.
Um, but the whole message around submission, that your husband makes the final decision and
Yeah.
you are supposed to follow, I believe puts the husband in the place of Jesus in her
Yep.
life. Because the only one that we're supposed to follow is Jesus. And the Bible even says that there is one God and one mediator between us and God, and that's Jesus. And when we try to put the husband in that place, it's really bad. Now, here's an interesting stat from our survey that did make it into the book about that. When we asked women, if the husband should be the leader and if he should make the final decision, the majority of Christian women who answered, and most of the women taking our survey would identify as evangelicals. The majority, I think it was upwards of 60% said that yes, the husband should make the final decision. But only roughly 21% actually practice that.
Yes.
So people believe it, but they don't practice it.
That's always been my hunch. Very interesting.
And as soon as you practice it, the divorce rate goes up by 8 times.
Wow.
You have 8
Fascinating.
times the divorce rate when the husband makes the decision, even if he consults the wife first. So even if he does what all of these marriage books are telling you to do, that he should seek her opinion, but then he makes the final decision, you have an 8 times higher divorce rate. And that is consistent with other surveys, like the John Gottman Institute has found
Yeah.
very similar things.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, we love John Gottman. He's just
Mm-hmm.
given us such a great gift. Well, both he and his wife have given us such a great gift with actual data. And I'm sure you discovered that my husband, being a marriage and family therapist, trained through a major Christian university as well. Even so, it's very commonly known in the therapy community that so many of the Christian books on marriage aren't based on any good therapy methods. They're just based
No.
on, like, some people will take one verse and cherry pick it and
Mm-hmm.
base an entire book on that. And,
Mm-hmm.
make it say things it never meant to say, make it be prescriptive for all people for all time, even when it was never even intended in that way. And so, or just make it a box that men and women have to fit in, which is not doing anyone a service. But yeah, so the Gottmans really just basically are basing their stuff on actual research, which is incredibly helpful for marriages. And so thank you for taking the time to do this incredible research and get the data, because I mean, the data speaks for itself, right? And that's
Well,
really helpful.
yeah, and our view, my belief is that when you follow God, your life is going to get better. Like
Yeah.
when you do things that God wants you to do, your life will be healthier. So if you are following things that you think God wants you to do and your life is not healthier, then I think we need to ask, is our interpretation wrong?
Yeah.
Because God does not want evil for us. God wants good for us, and God's commandments lead to good things. And so when we end up in real messes when we act out what we think we're supposed to be doing in marriage and it doesn't bring health, then we need to ask if we've interpreted scripture wrong. And I think that's what we've done, because almost all evangelical advice is based around gender.
Yeah.
And seeing stereotypes and seeing that these are prescriptive. So for instance, he wants sex all the time, she never wants sex. Emerson Eggerichs in Love and Respect said, if your husband is typical, he has a need you don't have. Talking about sex. So the typical man needs sex, the typical woman does not. This is what he said, and this is very common in evangelical books. But it's just not true.
Yeah.
Like, it's just simply not true. Women need sex too. It's not that women don't need sex. And even libido, what we found is that, in 60% of marriages, he does have the higher libido, but only in 60%.
Wow.
And I think it was even more like 59 or 58. In another 20%, their libidos are the same. And then in 20%, she actually has the higher libido.
Yeah. I know plenty of women like that in the Christian community.
And, the more he uses porn, the more his libido drops. And so,
Exactly.
this is a huge issue. And yet all of these Christian books are presenting sex as something which he wants and she doesn't.
Yeah.
And that doesn't even apply to the majority of marriages. Like it doesn't even apply.
Yeah. So you talked a little bit about stereotypes. I want to unpack that a little bit. So How do you think some of the stereotypes around sex and sexuality cause damage to both men and women when the church does get it wrong?
One of the most harmful teachings, for instance, that we measured was this idea that all men lust.
Mm,
Lust is every man's battle.
yep,
You
there's
know, and
books on that
yeah,
too.
huge book series have been written on that. That was one of the most destructive beliefs. It
Yeah.
was highly correlated with increased rates of sexual pain. It was highly correlated with decreased orgasm rates among women. And what was really interesting is that it decreased orgasm rates even if she didn't believe it, but only was taught it.
Wow, fascinating.
So she's going to youth group and she's hearing this. She's going to church and she's hearing this. She's never believed it, but it still
Mhm.
impacts her. Like just
Wow.
being in a culture where you are taught that every man is going to lust and
Yeah.
that men are incapable of seeing women as whole people, um, really impacts women. And it impacts them, especially when you hear it in high school. So women are hearing this in high school, in youth group, before they even meet their husbands.
Wow.
And then when they meet their husbands, they're less likely to trust their husbands. Even when we controlled for porn use and we controlled for how much guys actually do look at other women,
Yeah.
we still found that even women married to good guys
Yeah.
have a hard time trusting them if that's what they've been taught in high school. And that wrecks their sex life. It makes women far more likely to have sex only because they feel like they have to.
Yeah. Wow. So damaging. We've
Mm-hmm.
heard this for a while, right? But that one of the um, sexual organs we often forget about that's so important is the brain, and so this is
Yeah.
what we're talking
Mm-hmm.
about, those messages
Mm-hmm.
in your brain that have been fed to you for so many years, like you said, whether you believe it or not, really have
Mm-hmm.
a huge effect on you physically, and how
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
respond.
And what we try to do in the book is we try to say, okay, look, this is a teaching that's really common in evangelical circles. And there is some truth, like there's something underlying it. There's a reason why we teach this, but here's how you can reframe it so that it's biblical now. So instead of saying all men lust, it's every man's battle, you can just simply say a lot of people struggle with lust, but it is something which you can overcome through the power of the Holy Spirit simply by learning to respect others as whole people made in the image of God. Right?
Much
we
better.
don't we don't make it a gendered thing because a lot of women struggle with lust too. Like this
Oh yeah.
idea that only men are visual is such crap.
Yeah, it's not based on data, is it?
Well, no, and increasingly what brain studies have been showing, like if you look at the scientific journals that have come out, especially in the last 2 years, there's been meta-analyses going back and looking at all the previous studies done of visual stimulation, and all the MRI studies that have been done. And what they found is that actually women are as visually stimulated as men are. It's just that women have been preconditioned to only find certain things stimulating.
Wow.
And that hasn't been reinforced. Like men visual stimulation is reinforced culturally.
Yeah.
Women, it's
Yeah.
not.
Yeah.
And so, and what we're also finding is that increasingly it is being reinforced. And so you'll find that millennial women are far more likely to say that they're visually stimulated than, Generation X or boomer women. But it's simply because they grew up hearing that women are visually stimulated in a way that women of my generation didn't.
Yeah, makes absolute sense, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even when we look at TV, like from the 80s, my family or my husband and I are really watching Cobra Kai right now. It's just
Mm-hmm.
like we're reliving the 80s. But then you watch it in this generation and you see like the one character, Ralph Macchio's opponent, I'm forgetting his name, but he's like the one stuck in the 80s, like still thinking of women in a certain way. And you realize that's not appropriate in our culture at the moment. Like
Mm-hmm.
we've changed. And
Mm-hmm.
so it would make sense that women raised to see things differently would experience it differently, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. So you talked about this popular marriage book, Love and Respect.
Mhm.
And I'd like to dig into that a little bit more. I mean, obviously, we're not trying to make anyone look bad or make anyone upset, but I know that it's such a popular marriage book, so it's important to address it, because there are some things that I personally, years ago, when it first was getting popular and heard my friends talking about it, caused me to feel somewhat disturbed based on the things I was hearing and then read about it or read in the book. But it's written by a man who bases, much of the marriage relationship on one particular verse,
Mhm.
and has a lot of exclusivity around that or whatever. But the book, it really has caused a great deal of harm for both men and women. And so I'd love for you to describe why this narrow view and application of that particular verse at the neglect of all the other verses has caused everything from putting husbands and wives into these boxes to actual abuse in marriage.
Yeah. Well, love and respect is based on Ephesians 5:33, which in most English translations says, husbands love your wives and wives respect your husbands. However, if you look at the actual Greek, it does not say that.
Yeah.
It says, husbands love your wives, but then instead of saying and, there's not actually a command for women there. There's what's known as a hina clause and then a subjunctive. And a hina clause is, it generally is translated in most other places in the Bible as in order to or so that. And then the verb for respect is in the subjunctive. So it's not a command. It's saying, and so literally a better translation would be husbands love your wives in order that wives should respect their husbands. So it's like her respect is conditional on his love. And yeah, and there was a reason for that. If you look at what was happening in marriage in Roman times, women already had to respect their husbands. Husbands literally had the right to kill their wives at will. And so Paul was trying to upend all of this and say, look, if you want her to respect you, it needs to be based on the fact that you love her, not just based on the fact that she's your wife.
Yeah.
And so he was trying to put the emphasis in something very different. And yet instead, what Emerson Eggerichs did was he used an English translation. He never even looked at the Greek. He used an English translation and said that if husbands need to unconditionally love their wives, then wives need to unconditionally respect their husbands. And he used all these different components of respect, including believing his intuition over your own. So you don't trust your own intuition because women are more easily deceived. Giving hierarchy. So he has the right to make all decisions. And we already talked about how damaging that can be. Sex on demand. So, and this is really how I got into reading this book. In fact, this is how I got into this whole project. Even though I've been blogging since 2008, I had never actually read marriage books. Because I never wanted to plagiarize anyone. And I was always afraid that I would get my ideas from someone else. And so I just really didn't read books. I read blog posts and I read social media and I read news articles and studies, but I didn't read other books unless I was specifically asked to endorse it. And then one day, it was January of 2019, I had been following this Twitter conversation from a woman who said that she actually felt like she needed respect as much as she needed love, even more so. And I thought, I've never actually read that book. And so I have it. So I picked it up and I'm like an N in the Myers-Briggs. I'm an intuitive, not a sensing. So I'm all over the place. And so I don't do things in a logical order. Right. So I open the book up to the chapter that means the most to me, which is the sex chapter, which is almost at the end. And I start with just those 9 pages. I think it was about 9 pages. So it doesn't say, and it was as if an atomic bomb went off in my living room. I mean, I have never read anything so destructive when it comes to sex. And I couldn't believe it because I had actually been recommending this book at marriage conferences.
Wow.
I had it was the bestseller. So I assumed it was good, right? Because I'd never read it. And I do apologize to anyone who was ever at any of those conferences. And I've apologized before too. But what he basically said about sex is that, men have this need that women don't. Women need to give sex to their husbands. No matter what, or the husband will be tempted to have an affair or to lust. And women need to understand their husbands struggle with lust if women expect their husbands to understand women struggle with body image. And that's really all it said. And the funniest line, he was recording this conversation between a mother and a daughter, where the daughter was complaining about the husband and how much he wanted sex, and she just felt disconnected from him. And the mother said, why wouldn't you do something which takes so little time and makes him so happy? And I thought that was really funny, because why would anybody who thinks that sex is good for women celebrate the fact that it takes so little time?
Exactly. Really no one's paying attention to that. Right.
Like, it tells me a lot about what he thinks sex is.
It's sad. It's heartbreaking, actually, to think that that's a box he himself is in, and that so many people feel we have to fit in, because we don't. I mean, it goes directly against Song of Solomon. I mean, Paul read Song of Solomon, and I think when he was talking about men and women's bodies, the radical nature in a culture that said a man had ownership over his wife and she was his property, and it was arranged marriages, it wasn't for love. The concept of love in a marriage, I mean, I've lived in the Muslim world, I've covered my head and worn frumpy clothes and all that, and some of these things we're talking about, views of women were very similar in a lot of the Islamic teachings, and the culture that I was in for a long time under Islamic law. But even there, like, the ideas of sexuality are not the same. There's this whole idea of 9 parts of desire, and it's quite different. But I find so many things similar in terms of the rigid nature of, lust and those particular things that to me are harmful. They're harmful to the women and the men, right? And God, that's not what Paul was saying. Paul was saying something very different. He was like, marriage should have love in it, which was radical. And earn the respect of your wife, right? I mean, should even just assume it. And also, you don't own your own body. She doesn't own her own body. There's a mutuality in the one flesh relationship. I don't think people realize, in the white evangelical church in America, oftentimes how radical it was that Paul didn't just say the man owns the woman's body.
Right.
I mean,
he said up in arms. Exactly. Right. And what's interesting is that Eggerichs in that chapter of Love and Respect never once, not once, said that sex should feel good for women too.
Oh my goodness.
In the whole book, he never once even mentioned the fact that sex could feel good for women. When we looked at the 14 books that we measured for our study, we had a rubric of 12 marks of healthy female sexuality teaching, and we rated them on a scale of 0 to 4. Okay. And John Gottman's book, The 7 Principles of, what is it? Oh, seven Principles for Making Marriage Work. Yeah. That scored 47 out of 48. That was our secular control book. Scored 47 out of 48. So did the Penner's book, the Christian book, The Gift of Sex. Okay, very good book. Scored 47 out of 48. Do you want to guess what Love and Respect scored?
I'm afraid. Much lower, I assume.
0.
Oh my God.
Literally scored 0.
How sad.
It didn't get, and this is the best-selling book that we looked at.
Oh my God.
Scored 0. Never blamed women for affairs, blamed women for men's lust, never mentioned women's sexual pleasure, never mentioned anything about consent, said she never had an option to say no. It was really abysmal. But the majority of Christian books failed.
Wow.
Like, the majority of Christian books fell in the harmful category.
Which I would assume has some serious ramifications on, you were talking about even just pain and sexual intercourse that a woman experiences. I mean, if you just took that particular part, would be huge, but there's so many other things. Let's dig into that idea of consent a little bit, because there's a lot of conversation around that with the Me Too movement, and then also the Church Too movement. And there's so many correlations. We could spend a whole podcast on that alone, but as a mom raising my sons and my daughter to understand consent, that it takes 2 people to agree. And it's not just no means no, it's yes means yes, right? And and I do have friends very close to me that have experienced marital rape, and it's a concept we often don't talk about. But let's talk about consent and what books like Love and Respect and other Christian books that are bestsellers can do to be harmful in our minds about what that looks like.
Yeah, what we found really difficult was how many Christian best-selling books actually had incidences of marital rape and didn't call it that.
Wow.
For instance, His Needs, Her Needs had a man saying he was complaining that his wife never wanted sex, and he said, I feel like I have to force her, like I'm actually raping her.
Oh my God.
If you feel like you're raping her, you probably are, because sex and rape don't feel the same. And yet the author just left it hanging there. He didn't say anything about it. Every Man's Battle has several stories of rape, which they do not call rape. and sexual assault and abuse, which they do not call abuse. They call it the sin of losing his purity as opposed to what he actually was doing to her. But the most disturbing was in the book, The Act of Marriage, which was the bestseller for people probably of Generation X. Like if you got married between, let's say, 1977 and 1995, that was probably the sex book you were given. So most pastors today, that's the sex book they would have been given. And it has a story of a girl who is getting married, and her aunt tells her that sex is terrible. And Tim LaHaye, the author, talks about how terrible Aunt Matilda is for doing this. And he explains that when Aunt Matilda was married, her husband, who was much older than her, pinned her down while she was screaming and raped her. And this continued throughout their marriage. And now she was telling her niece how terrible sex was. And Tim LaHaye's point was, isn't it awful how she wrecked this girl's view of sex? And isn't it a tragedy because this woman and her equally unhappy husband. So he called the husband who raped the wife throughout their marriage equally unhappy as the wife. And I read the 4th edition, which was published, I believe, in the late 90s. So it's not like they didn't know better.
Right.
But it went through 4 different editions and nobody thought to take that anecdote out.
Wow. I mean, it's bad enough that Matilda went through that, but then Tim LaHaye endorsing it and the way that the man is the center of the story when he's maybe a psychopath.
And so my dedication in the book is to Aunt Matilda and everybody like her, because consent is just missing from the Christian conversation. The only book that we looked at that talked about consent in explicit terms was Gottman's book, which was the secular book. Now, I have to say, we didn't look at my books, and my books would have qualified. Like we were looking at bestsellers in the sex genre, and my book, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, would have fallen in that category. But obviously, we couldn't look at my own book. So I'm not saying that no Christian books talk about consent, because mine do. But that was a lot of books talked about how. The better books like Boundaries in Marriage, The Gift of Sex, A Sacred Marriage, all talked about how, there might be times where she doesn't want sex and that's okay, but none of them talked about making sure that you had consent.
Wow. Mm-hmm. That's very troubling.
And most books, the vast majority of books, used the do not deprive passage from 1 Corinthians 7 to say that she is not allowed to say no. So sheet music said, sometimes you might feel like you have to force yourself, but you need to do that. Sheet music said that when she's postpartum or on her period, she has to give him a hand job or a blow job so that he doesn't watch porn.
Wow. That's such a twisted view of sexuality.
Yeah.
And not at all what I read in the Bible anywhere, like Old Testament to New Testament, and like nowhere. So let's talk about that. How would you describe human sexuality and the way God actually intended it to be?
I think it is supposed to be a mutually pleasurable, intimate experience. And intimacy is just so missing from the conversation. In Genesis 4, if you read it in the King James, you read Genesis 4:1, and Adam knew his wife Eve, and they conceived unto them a son. And I remember when I was in junior high reading that and thinking that was hilarious, like God was embarrassed of using the real word or something. But, as I looked at that as I got older, you realize the Hebrew word there for Adam knew his wife is the same word that's used in the Psalms when David says, "Search me and know me, O God." It means this deep longing to be intimate, to be completely connected. And I think that the reason that God uses that word in Genesis is to tell us that sex is more than just physical. Yeah. It's supposed to be this deep knowing. And I think that's something which we often miss when we talk solely in terms of men's rights to have sex whenever they want. Because if it's only about him and his needs, it's not a knowing. It can't be a knowing unless her needs matter just as much as his does. And that's where we're really going wrong, is we are looking at sex as something which she gives and he takes, as opposed to something which they experience together.
Yes, absolutely. I think the odd thing is sometimes you'll hear in the white evangelical church messages that the church is different from the culture, blaming, I don't know, Hollywood or music or other things in TV that distort sexuality, and therefore that's what's wrong. But it seems as though it's not without, it's within the church that's
Mm-hmm.
often, saying these things. And yeah, it is. Marriage is a mystery. It's the way that we see somehow Christ loves the church in a way that a man loves a woman, and that there's something really beautiful there. And it can't only be physical, or it wouldn't be the beauty that we see that God had created it to be. And so, yeah, it's sad on just many levels that Christian marriages in the U.S. and white evangelical churches in particular are missing out on that particular experience of what it could be. That there's a whole other level out there,
Mm-hmm.
that when we don't talk about it, we're missing. That God wants for us. That's what it means to have abundant life. That's what it means to be in God's kingdom. Mutuality is there from the beginning, right? And so it is sad the way we've distorted it and seen it in this way. So I'm so thankful that you're clearing some of these things up. I do want to dig into a couple more things. One is, so in the Love and Respect book in particular, I think some people might be tempted, in any questioning of the book, if this is a book that they have, based their whole marriage on, or maybe they've taught this book and maybe they're a pastor and they have done,
Mm-hmm.
group studies on this book and they found it very valuable, and have told tens, hundreds, thousands of people to read it. Like, I mean, I know you also
Mm-hmm.
recommended it, but some people might hear us saying that we're saying men don't need respect, because sometimes when we challenge things, then people start to dig their heels in on a different thing. And so no
Mm-hmm.
one's saying here men don't need respect. We're only saying women need it too, right? And then there's this stereotype of women, wives, and moms in this culture that they're just supposed to give and give and give to everyone else's needs. And that's a stereotype that we have, right? So to say women are the only ones, so the book basically says, the subtitle, if I'm not wrong, women have desires and men have needs, right? And
Mm-hmm.
so, but that seems to be letting the culture interpret scripture, which we are always told not to do.
Mm-hmm.
And it's clear, Song of Solomon, like I said, paints a really beautiful picture of mutuality where they both have desires and they both have needs. And so I would love for you to talk about where you've seen in the work that you do where cultural stereotypes are superseding scripture in these ways.
Yeah, well, I mean, when it comes to love and respect, we did do an open-ended question on our survey where we never mentioned any book or resource or anything in our survey. Like, we never named anything, we never named any author at all. And then we had an open-ended question about what books or resources or ministries have helped your marriage and which ones have harmed your marriage. And love and respect was the number one resource that women reported had harmed their marriage.
Wow.
So and we had so many different answers, and love and respect was number one. And some of the others in the top five were like Every Man's Battle was up there. I Kissed Dating Goodbye was up there.
And he's
Uh,
apologized for that book, right?
he did
Yeah.
apologize. So we didn't beat up on that book at all because he
Yeah.
apologized
He did
for
it
it. So
himself. Yeah.
we did
Right.
not beat up on that. Um, Even Focus on the Family was number five, largely because they promote a lot of this bad stuff. Um, so, Love and Respect is one of those books that a lot of people say did help them. But, you know, if something helps people, let's say it helps 70% of people, but it really harms 30%, we really shouldn't be promoting it. And a book can harm in one of two ways. It can either spread information which is harmful in and of itself. And I believe Love and Respect does do that because it tells women that they aren't supposed to speak up when something is bothering them or when something is wrong.
Wow.
He gives an example. If your husband's a workaholic, you're allowed to say 1 to 3 sentences to him about this every 10 to 20 days. But other than that, you must be silent.
Where is that in the Bible? What in the world?
Exactly. No, it isn't, because otherwise you're being disrespectful. And this just goes against everything we know about how we're supposed to deal with sin. And it's like Eggerichs puts stoking your husband's ego above spurring one another on to love and good deeds. God's
Christianity at all. No.
God's main desire for us is that we be transformed into the likeness of Christ.
Yeah.
Romans 8:29. But when we enable sin and when we enable selfishness, we do not help people be transformed into the likeness of Christ.
Yeah.
We get people going in the other direction. And so I think that the book harms just for that reason alone. The other way that a book can harm is that it gives advice which, if followed in a healthy marriage, would not harm. But if followed in a marriage where there is ill will or there is emotional abuse or physical abuse, would harm. And it doesn't help people distinguish whether they're in a good marriage or a bad marriage. And this book fails on that in so many levels. Just one example, it talks about a man who was in jail for physically abusing his wife. And then the man repented and was out of jail. And she let him back into the home because he repented. And so the pastor told her, and so she let him back in. And now it was her responsibility to not provoke his anger.
Wow.
And Eggerichs wrote for several pages on how she could make sure that she was respecting him and not provoking his anger. And it was like Eggerichs didn't even talk about the love bombing cycle, which is so common in cases of abuse. When the abuser will apologize and will do everything right in order to get the relationship back so that then they can continue to abuse. And it's like, there's no excuse for doing that.
Right.
Especially because we know from his own blog, and even in the book itself, he said women were telling him that their husbands were using this message to hurt them.
Wow.
And yet he still gave the message.
Wow. It's cold. It's a cold reality, isn't it?
Yeah. So it ignores abuse. And I think that's something which the Christian church should not be doing. Our society does that,
Yep.
but we like to say we're better than society, but we're still doing it. Like, we are not valuing women. The church says that the world is all about feminism and we're all about, God's purpose for the family, right? As if feminism is the bad thing and patriarchy is the good thing. But the world is not about feminism.
No.
If you look at the history of the world, it's about patriarchy.
Yeah.
It's about men having control, and it's about women being really hurt by that.
Yeah.
And so, we're looking at the world in terms of like the last 20 years as opposed to the history of the world. And the history of the world is women being really hurt by men. And to say that, oh, well, we're countercultural because we're going to put men in charge of women, that's not countercultural. That's what the culture has been for the entire history of the world.
Right. It's consistent.
Yeah, exactly. So if you want to be countercultural, you need to do what Jesus did, which is value women as whole people and talk to women and consider women's opinions and treat them as valuable.
Yeah. And make them central to his stories. That's one of my favorite parts. They weren't side characters, protagonists in many stories. And at a time when women were property, and didn't get to choose their husbands, they were kind of ushered here and there, and they were at the mercy of men in many cases just for finances, like if you were divorced, that was the worst, which is why they, there's this strong commands to take care of widows and orphans because they would have been destitute otherwise. When you have a few women in the New Testament that for some reason, had large amounts of money, and they funded Jesus's ministry for the most part too, which is another stereotype blown, but so many things that Jesus did was intentional. He's much more radical than I think the white evangelical church in North America realizes or is willing to consider. It would really flip things. Hierarchy would be not a thing. It would be so different if we really truly followed Jesus. And we have this troubling situation in the United States right now where women are leaving the church in large numbers. And I think, this whole conversation that we're having, it's bigger than just sex between a man and a woman, what we're talking about here. It's this whole notion of, especially some of the things being talked about in the Love and Respect book and other Christian marriage books like you talked about, and the stereotypes around women and men. It goes beyond the bedroom of marriages and Christian homes, right? This forms how men and women treat each other in general in the church, where men supposedly are the only ones having needs and women must fulfill those by respecting men. And so have you perceived that kind of thing in the church where it goes beyond just women respecting as wives, respecting their husbands, that it's also in the church in this way?
Definitely. And I think that we see that in the way that in most evangelical churches, women really don't have a voice. They're not invited to leadership at all. And the idea is that women are to be submissive to men, which again is just not biblical.
Yeah.
And but even our whole definition, well, actually, no, that's not true. Women are to be submissive to men, but men are to be submissive to women as well.
Right.
Because Ephesians 5:21 is to submit to one another as to the Lord. And then Ephesians 5:22 is women to your husbands. The verb isn't even there because the
Yeah.
verb is inferred in the Greek from the verse before.
Right.
So this verse that we often use to say women are inferior, women submit to your husbands as to the Lord. In Greek, literally it's women to your husbands as to the Lord. And that verb is inferred from 21, where it's about everybody submitting to one another.
Right.
And if it's supposed to be everybody submitting to one another, then it isn't about decision making and authority. It's about
Right.
serving.
Yeah.
It's like everyone is supposed to serve. And that's what it's about, is having this attitude of service to one another and this attitude of humility to one another in the same way that Jesus talks about in Philippians 2. You know, that we're to have the same mind that is in Christ Jesus, who did not consider equality with God something to be grasped, but made himself, nothing, and took on the form of human likeness. And that's what we're supposed to be doing. That's submission. It's not letting him make the decision.
Right.
It's
Yeah.
everybody serving each other.
Yeah.
And I think that that's what we've missed, is we've made it all into something which is very authority based, and that does not have good repercussions for either men or women if we want to emulate Christ.
Yes, absolutely. There's just so much more. There's so much more in God's kingdom work around the world that we could do if it really was shoulder to shoulder. And that women, there could be grace and truth, exchanged between men and women, brothers and sisters in the church. But when we limit ourselves to these boxes, men are the ones with needs and women have to respect them. And it has this tone where the men have the dreams, the men have the aspirations, the ambitions, and the women are just there to support them. But that's not how God made it. That's not what it meant, even in the very beginning. And it's certainly not what we see in the lives of Old Testament women like Deborah and, the women around Jesus, and Mary and Martha and Mary Magdalene and his own mother, women taking very central roles in God's story throughout kingdom work through all time. But I do want to unpack a little bit here at the end around, there's a lot of talk around rape culture in the culture ever since Me Too, hashtag Me Too. And there's articles like the Houston Chronicle a couple of years ago that exposed a lot of issues within the Southern Baptist world. And, certainly it's not the only church, and Catholics have had issues and other denominations as well. But when we have these ideas that are very rigid around men and women, and we have these very hierarchical situations where men are, not necessarily expected to listen to women or their opinions and that type of thing. And particularly, like you mentioned earlier, where women are silenced. When women are silenced in the church, they're also silenced in violence, and therefore they can't often speak up. And if they're told explicitly in books like you just mentioned not to say anything, then it's just not only in the marriage, but it's happening in the church in general. So speak to that a little bit.
Well, one of the biggest things that we found, like the biggest message in terms of marriage and sex, is this whole do not deprive thing. Like, a woman is obligated to have sex with her husband when he wants it. And so you go into marriage with this obligation, duty sex. And that idea wrecks sex for women. It's one of the most destructive things. And it's the thing that causes sexual pain. Like, the effect of believing that you are obligated to give your husband sex when he wants it, which is what the majority of evangelical Christian sex and marriage books teach.
Wow.
That idea has the same effect size on the rates of sexual pain and vaginismus as being abused does.
Wow.
Okay, so just that idea. And yet that is what is widely taught. Now, when you combine that teaching with the teaching that all men lust, it's every man's battle. And if all men lust and they can't do anything about it, then it's incumbent on women to stop them from lusting. So there's another belief, boys will try to push girls' sexual boundaries. And so you have to be the gatekeeper. That's something else that we looked at. And then, of course, there's the girls, don't be a stumbling block to the guys. And you lead to this idea that men can't control themselves, that men have these overwhelming needs for sex. And if something happens, it's likely your fault. And so if it happens within a marriage, well, there's no such thing as marital rape. According to many of these books, they don't even mention it. They don't define it. They don't talk about consent. And there can be rape in marriage, by the way. It's
Oh, of course.
definitely
Yeah.
but then it also goes outside of marriage too. I know so many women, and we talked to so many women in our focus groups who were actually victims of date rape when they were teenagers and young adults, but they didn't know that until many
Wow.
years later because they thought it was their fault because they hadn't said no forcefully enough, or their skirt had been too short, or they had led him on and then he couldn't stop, because once he gets to the point of no return, he can't stop. And this sort of thing is talked about and is taught in books like For Young Women Only by Shaunti Feldhahn. We looked at that one, and we looked at some of the ways that she talked. Like, she actually measured whether boys wanted to or could stop in a sexual relationship. But she was asking guys who thought they were in a consensual relationship. So she's basically asking, she asked non-Christian teenage boys if they would want to or if they would stop if they were in a making out situation. And newsflash, a lot of guys said no, we wouldn't stop because they want to have sex. Okay, if she had simply said, if a girl says no, would you stop? But she didn't ask that. She simply said, if you were making out, would you want to stop, or would you find it hard to stop, or would you stop? And like 82% of guys said no, they wouldn't stop. But the girl never told him to, and she was talking to non-Christian boys, and yet she used that stat to tell girls that boys aren't able to stop, and so they needed to be careful. And so we talked to so many girls and women now who had read that book and who hadn't realized they were date raped because they thought it was their fault.
It's so sad. It's so harmful because you take that for years. It's so hard to work through.
Yeah.
And there's so much talk right now. There's a lot of, I didn't grow up in this whole purity culture movement, but I do have friends that did, and have encountered it even as an adult in certain circles. But there's a lot of challenging of purity culture right now. And so talk a little bit about that, how that affects things for women.
I think just being able to understand that you were created as a sexual being, because that's one of the big things that purity culture tells women, is that sex is bad. Even the phrase "stay pure until you're married," which we say all the time. First of all, we equate purity with virginity, which is crazy because our purity is not based on what we do with our bodies. Our purity is based on what Jesus did with his. And we need to get that right. But when we say stay pure until you're married, there's an insinuation that as soon as you're married, you're no longer pure.
Yeah, that's a terrible feeling.
Yeah. And it's like as soon as you have sex, you're not pure. Having sex does not make someone impure. You can be married and be very pure, even if you're having sex every day. Like, sex is not this bad thing. And purity is not about sexuality in particular. You can be impure because you gossip too much. Like, you can be impure because you're greedy. And this equating of purity only with sexuality is just a very harmful thing. And it makes sex seem very ugly. And then when you combine that with all these messages about how boys can't help themselves and girls feel like they're the gatekeepers, like, I am responsible not just for my own purity, which again is seen only in sexual terms, but also for his purity. And when you take that into marriage, what we found is that belief that I am the gatekeeper is highly correlated with women's lack of orgasm. Because when she's in a, you think about a makeout situation for teenagers, and, he's thinking, this is great, I'm having fun. And she's thinking the entire time, is he breathing too hard? Is he able to control himself? Am I still in control? I need to be careful. Should I stop now? Should I stop now? Should I stop now? And we talked to so many women who described it as, I felt like I was outside of my body watching myself.
Wow.
Or I felt like I was a spectator to what was going on because I was always judging what was going on. I was never just experiencing it.
Oh
And
goodness.
that training of yourself to get outside of your body and judge what's going on instead of just experience is something that it's very hard to get rid of. And so then you get married and you feel like you have to be in control all the time. Like you can't just get carried away. You can't just let your guard down. And so many
Wow.
women have a lot of difficulty doing that. And if you can't let your guard down, you can't orgasm, which I think is why there's such a huge orgasm gap among Christians, between men and women in marriage.
Yeah, that's it's sad, right? Because even just like in basic human psychology classes, you know, just gender differences and things like that, like there's, you know, just some basic things you can learn in science about that we don't really teach in the church. And it's, I mean, it's so far from what we would ever do when we're so busy
Yeah.
in the US church, in particular, in some cases, focusing so much on the purity part of it, right? As if that's the only conversation to have, as if, and I attribute it a lot just because, you know, I grew up in the Venezuelan church, which has some very, you know, different cultural understandings of sexuality that are totally not like at all what we're talking about here. But, you know, there's a lot of the fairy tales that we tell in white culture. I guess maybe they're from Europe, but it's about this white maiden that needs to be protected and rescued and protected at all costs. And it seems like that really played more into a lot of the ideas in purity culture than a lot of other things, the way the Puritans experienced their religion and Christianity, and the lens they put onto things. And some of it just still feels like it's still quite there.
I think it definitely is. I think we're getting better. I really believe millennials are changing this. I think that's why millennials are leaving the church, honestly, is because they don't want the hypocrisy anymore. They don't want an authority-based religion anymore. And so much of this is authority-based. It's putting authority in the hands of pastors and these teachers. It's putting authority in the hands of husbands. And what people want is they just want authentic relationship. They want authentic relationship with God without having to worry about what other people are thinking. They want authentic relationship with each other where we can be truly vulnerable and truly intimate and without all the trappings. And I think millennials are getting it. I have so much hope for millennials and Generation Z. I think they're going to change everything. And I think the fact they're leaving the church is probably a good thing because they're not leaving God. A lot of them are not leaving God. They're just leaving the church. And I'm excited to see what they're going to build instead, but I think that instead of bemoaning the fact that they're leaving, we should start listening to why, and we should start seeing how we have seriously messed them up. Because what's so funny, I actually wrote this book with two millennials. So my daughter, Rebecca Lindenbach, and Joanna Sawatsky, who's a family friend and she's a statistician, epidemiologist, and all kinds of fancy things. She did all the stats for us. And their experience of purity culture was so much worse than mine. I grew up in the 80s. I was a teenager in the 80s. They were teenagers in the 2000s and 2010s. And you could never have made me believe in the 80s that the white evangelical church would be doing, 25 years later, what it did.
Yeah.
We were further ahead in the 80s.
Yeah, we were.
Everything went backwards.
Yeah.
And I think millennials are seeing that, and I think they're going to fix it. And I think we need to not shy away from criticizing and from coming to terms with how much harm we did. It's interesting. Sheet music, For Women Only, Love and Respect, Every Man's Battle, they were all published within 4 years of each other.
Wow.
All of these books that really did a lot of harm that we found were all published within 4 years of each other. And that's around the same time I Kissed Dating Goodbye came out as well. That was a little bit earlier, I think 2 years earlier, but it was all that time from like the very late 90s to 2005. That's when all this weird stuff came out. And I think it's time that we had a reckoning. And I think it's time that we started apologizing to the younger generation and admitting the harm that we did, and then looking at how we can bring this back to Jesus. And that's really what we're trying to do with the Great Sex Rescue, is reframe these messages and bring it back to what Jesus wants for our marriage and our sex life, and get rid of all the crap that we've put on top of it in Christian terms.
Oh man, I have the same hope, and I believe it. I believe that it's an opportunity, right? We can either go the direction that the Spirit is leading, or we can be left behind. So people make their choices. But I do have a lot of hope that the challenge that millennials are bringing just by walking out the door and making us
Mm-hmm.
wake up and notice will be something that does awaken the bride of Christ in a new way, in a healthier way,
Mm-hmm.
and that we will focus on Jesus more. Not so much about what it, the man boxes and the woman boxes we put each other in based
Mm-hmm.
on culture, but about being more like Jesus. And the more we walk toward Jesus, the more we all, experience that unity and mutuality and everything God intended. So I'd love for you to leave us with some resources that you recommend, obviously your books, and so
Yes.
mention those please once again, and we'll put them in the show notes as well. But any other resources, podcasts or speakers or books that you recommend?
Yeah, well, for sure, find me at toLoveHonorAndVacuum.com. I have a podcast. I have a blog where I blog every day, usually about sex. And for the next 2 months, we're going to be going over some of the really bad teachings that are in so many of these books and how we can reframe them. The Great Sex Rescue, if you want to pre-order it, would help me so much. Comes out March 2nd. But I also have a great book called 31 Days to Great Sex for couples on how to find sex, amazing sex, physically, emotionally, and intimately. And so that's a really fun one. And then, if this is just something that you're struggling with, I have some awesome courses on how to boost your libido. I have a new orgasm course because I know that's a big roadblock for many women. So we just get really real on my stuff. And that's necessary. I think there needs to be safe places to talk about this stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you for the gift that you are to women, to men, to future generations, to the church, and all that you're doing. Thank you for just being brave, because it's not an easy thing to talk about, but it's so, so, so needed. So thank you for being on the show and telling us about it today.
Thank you.
Well, are you able to breathe a little bit now? Because going into this episode, it probably was a bit of anxiety for you. It was a little bit for me. I'm going to just be honest. It's not an easy topic to talk about, but Sheila doesn't she just like make it feel so normal and easy to talk about in so many ways? She really gets down to just the practical help that we all need to learn what's factual and true and what's actually in the scripture, what's not, what's part of our culture, what's stuff that just causes our minds to think thoughts that aren't helpful, and just those messages that women have gotten both in the culture and unfortunately within the church that hold us back from all the abundant life God wants us to have within our marriages, within our own minds and hearts, and just how we see ourselves, who we actually are. And I love her approach. I love that she's brave and courageous to take it on, because it's not an easy conversation, but we need it. We need to talk about it because health and wellness and especially spiritual health is so connected to our bodies. We so often want to separate those two as if we could, but especially my years living in Asia, I just really began to appreciate how interconnected our mind, body, and spirit all are. And for those of us who follow Jesus, we understand that our bodies are the temple of the Holy Spirit, where the Holy Spirit dwells within us. So we certainly want to take care of our bodies. But our brains impact how we think about our bodies. And we're often hard on our bodies. We often want to like punish our bodies and go on these difficult crash diets or do these extreme exercises as a way to punish and shape our bodies into something different. But on a certain level, that's not good for us. We need to understand how connected we are to our bodies, and that our bodies are created to be whole and to be well. And so the area of sexuality, it certainly impacts that on so many levels. I feel like we just scratched the surface today, and there's so much more to learn. But hopefully she gave you a diving board to dive into that swimming pool and just get in there and learn and not be afraid. And fortunately, she has many resources, her books that she's written herself, and just her team that are reading through all the different books out there and rating them. And you can check out all things Sheila Gregoire on her site, and definitely check out her new book coming out in March. I also am very excited to announce someone who really needs no introduction, which is Nancy Ortberg. So we are all just going to be so blessed next episode when she joins us to talk about how faith and work can impact women in the church. She herself is the author of several books. She's been a pastor for many years in the United States, and now she leads Transforming the Bay for Christ here in the Bay Area. She's smart. She knows who she is. She has lived long enough to see things that work and things that don't, and she's a great example of what it means to just fully embody who God has made you to be. She knows her flaws, she knows her strengths, and she tries to, as much as possible, to live out of her strengths. She's a leader. She's also a leader of leaders, and she has taught and trained quite a bit on leadership. She worked alongside Patrick Lencioni for years, teaching and training leadership around the world. And so we are going to have so much to learn from her next week. So definitely tune in for that. And in the meantime, just take care of yourself, take care of your body, recognize how your body's feeling in these very difficult days where our brains are just dealing with so much trauma as we watch what's happening on the news, both with COVID and things happening politically. And I know around the world, there are multiple situations that we're all dealing with. So take care of yourselves and reach out to a friend who maybe God brings to mind as somebody who might need encouragement this week. And we'll join together next week with Nancy Wartburg. Bye, guys. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper. And then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/a world of difference.